Welcome to the Vital Spirit podcast. I'm Dr. Kelly Livingston, a naturopathic physician and your guide to a new health reality, one that connects body, mind, and spirit. Together, we'll dive deep into the art and science of holistic healing. Through working with hundreds of women through midlife transitions, I've discovered something profound. Most of our physical and emotional challenges are rooted in a maladaptive stress response. And true healing begins when we regulate our nervous system. Each episode will explore complex health topics in simple, empowering ways, uncover the deeper wisdom within each of us, and share practical tools for nervous system regulation to help you awaken your vital force and create lasting wellness. So, if you're ready to reconnect with yourself, your health, and your purpose, let's begin this journey together, so you can experience life more fully human and deeply healed. Hi, and welcome back to the Vital Spirit podcast. I'm Dr. Kelly Livingston, a naturopathic physician, gut-brain axis specialist, nervous system obsessed clinician, and someone who has personally walked through multiple seasons of depression in my own life, including in perimenopause. And this has given me a much deeper understanding of what depression truly is and what it absolutely is not. Today's episode is one that essentially I've been preparing for my whole career through my undergraduate degree in psychology, my naturopathic training, nervous system work, clinical practice over the last 13 years, and as I said, my own lived experience. This is part one of a two-part series on depression. This is the episode that you definitely will want to share with your friends, your family, your partner, your therapist, your doctor, and maybe even your younger self. Part one of this two-part series is all about defining the terrain, what depression actually is, what depression is not, how to distinguish sadness from depressive episodes, and why depression looks different in different people, especially women in midlife, and why depression is almost never caused by one single thing. That would be great if it were, but typically it is multifactorial. In part two, we'll cover what we can do about depression. This is my favorite part. The tools, the protocols that I've had success with, the nervous system work, the nutrition, the botanical medicine, the psychotherapy, and of course, the psycho-spiritual work. How do we build a life that protects our mental health rather than draining it will be the focus of the second part of this series. Before we go any further, I do want to take a moment for a brief but very necessary safety note. We will be talking about depression today, including suicidal thoughts and ideation. Nothing in this episode replaces crisis support or medical care. If you or someone that you love is thinking about harming themselves, please seek immediate help. This is extremely important, and I do want to highlight an important difference between passive and active suicidal ideation. These terms matter because they do guide how we support someone experiencing this level of depression. It informs us around what level of care they need and how urgently they need it. So passive suicidal ideation sounds like, I don't want to be here. I'm tired of living like this. I wish I could disappear. This is a common presence when we are struggling with depression for some people. There is no plan, there is no intention to act, there is no immediate danger, but there is emotional pain, hopelessness, exhaustion, or a desire to escape this reality, to escape this suffering. Passive suicidal ideation is still serious. It deserves attention, compassion, support, but it does not automatically mean that someone is in imminent danger. I also don't want you to feel any shame if you're someone who has experienced this. This is different from active suicidal ideation. Active suicidal ideation includes thoughts of harming yourself, thinking about ways you might do it, or a plan. Having an actual plan in place is absolutely active suicidal ideation. And this is something that does require action on the part of those supporting this person. Again, there is absolutely no shame here, but active suicidal ideation is a medical emergency. It requires immediate intervention, just like a heart attack or a stroke would. Both passive and active suicidal thoughts are expressions of pain, overwhelm, or nervous system collapse. They do not mean that someone necessarily wants to die. Often they really just want relief, a sense of safety or connection, or help finding a way through the intensity of what they're experiencing. If this is you or someone that you love, here's what you do. If you are experiencing active suicidal thoughts or you're worried that you might take action, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. This is available 24/7 to you, and you can be anonymous. You can go to your nearest ER. You can call 911 if you're in immediate danger or someone you love is. You absolutely can and should reach out to a close family member or friend that you trust and feel safe with. Tell your therapist, a doctor, or provider immediately. Please be honest in communicating these feelings when you have them. If you have no one to reach out to, you can contact my clinic. There are people here to support you, and you do not want to be alone with these thoughts. Even if you are experiencing passive thoughts, such as, I don't want to do this anymore, I wish I could disappear, please reach out, because although these thoughts are common in depression, they're common in burnout and deep overwhelm, they are things that we can get ahead of, and reaching out to someone for help is the first step. So please do not wait for things to get worse to get support. Whether these are active or passive thoughts, these are symptoms. They are not your identity. They are not who you are, and they will not last forever. So let's take a deep breath before we begin. I really did feel like that was important to state before we started this episode. Okay. So why does this episode matter so much to me? As I've mentioned, I've struggled with depression myself, and very often I will see that patients kind of toss this word depression around when they first come in to work with me. They'll say, my depression, or I'm depressed, or I feel depressed. But when I dig at this and I ask some deeper questions around, what does that feel like for you? What is that experience like for you? Very often, many patients can't actually describe what they mean. So they might know something is off, but they don't exactly know what that something is. So you might say, I don't feel like myself anymore. I can't quite place it, but I feel like something is going on, but I don't know what it is. Or you might not have the language for what's happening inside. And because depression is so deeply misunderstood, especially in perimenopause, many women will minimize what they're experiencing or brush it off. And again, I'll commonly hear things like, it's just my depression, or it's just my hormones, or I get depressed when my hormones are fluctuating. We might assume it's just aging, or you might assume it's a character flaw, or there's something quote unquote wrong with you, or it's something you just have to push through. So there's a lot of confusion around what it even is, again, especially through midlife. Especially in midlife, there can be a shame or a confusion. I'll often hear, well, I should be happy. My life looks great from the outside. We talked about this in our Dark Night of the Soul episode. So there can be a lot of confusion, and there is this kind of deeper cultural belief where we think depression means you might be crying all the time. And that's not necessarily true either. It has many faces and many pathways. I really hope that this episode brings some clarity around the biopsychosocial root causes and nervous system root causes, and also the kind of clarity that can bring your agency back if you're someone who's struggling with depression. So let's touch on how widely this is impacting people. So about 6 to 7% of adults in the United States have a depressive episode in any given year. That's a lot. And nearly 10% will experience a depressive episode at some point in their lifetime. Globally, over 300 million people struggle with depression. And these numbers don't even touch the millions of women with high functioning depression, which I'll have a whole episode on. Masked depression. Depression can be very common in ADHD. Subclinical depression, which we'll touch on today. Hormonal depression, or a nervous system shutdown that looks like depression. And one thing I really want to make clear today is that depression is not binary. It's not something you have or don't have. It really does exist on a spectrum. When I was studying psychology as an undergrad, one of the things that I was really focused on was in personality psychology, especially, so many of these things that we might label or diagnose also exist on a spectrum in the general population. So on one end, there might be sadness, melancholy, emotional heaviness. You might move into dysthymia, that persistent low grade kind of chronic grayness that can last for years. We might have trauma linked depression, inflammatory depression. I had an entire episode on inflammatory depression. We might have postpartum or perimenopausal depression, existential depression. What is my point here? Again, we had that episode on the dark night of the soul. Depressive disorders, depression woven into your personality style, depression rooted in that dorsal vagal nervous system collapse. There's so many different flavors, and you can exist on this spectrum of depression at many different points in life. And this is different than just feeling sad, right? So sadness, you can kind of think of the weather for the day. So you might have a rain cloud of sadness move in, but it's going to then move out, versus a longer lasting depression is more like the climate of the place that you're living, where it's really influencing everything you're experiencing day in and day out. So before we talk more about clinical diagnoses, let's talk a little bit about what depression feels like. So when a woman comes into me in perimenopause or menopause, or even younger, so I do treat quite a bit of mental health disorders, anxiety and depression in teens and young adults as well. So oftentimes this will be described as everything feels heavy. Very often there's this physical heavy feeling to depression. Often women will say, I feel flat, like nothing touches me. So you're feeling flat in the sense of not feeling high or low, or feeling too high or too low. You might feel like your spark is gone, like that vital spark is gone. You might feel, I'm exhausted no matter what I do. You might feel like the things that you used to love are meaningless or don't bring you the same joy that they used to. You might feel disconnected from yourself. You might feel brain fog or slower cognition. So you might describe that also feeling very overwhelming. So you might be overwhelmed by tiny things, or irritable, like your bucket's overflowing, your window of tolerance is smaller. You might feel like you're disappearing. Sometimes patients who are struggling with depression describe feeling invisible. Or you might feel like you're watching yourself live life instead of actually feeling like you're in it, living it. And especially through perimenopause and menopause, depression can show up in ways that don't feel like sadness at all. So you might be sleeping too much or not sleeping at all. You might lose your appetite, or you're craving carbs and sugar intensely. You might feel joyless, like nothing matters, emotionally flat, short fused or easily irritated, withdrawn socially, unmotivated, really just not like yourself. And something that no one really talks about is what's called psychomotor retardation. So when we are in a depressive episode, our body can actually feel really heavy. You might feel like your movements are slow, or your thoughts are slow, or like you're moving underwater through molasses. And this happens with severe depression. It happens with low iron, anemia, which can be a cause of depression. It happens with EBV reactivation. We had a whole episode on that too. It happens with mitochondrial dysfunction, and it happens with dorsal vagal shutdown. So I'm starting to get into, as you can see, some of those root causes that then might manifest as depression. You can also have something called psychomotor agitation, which feels the opposite. So that feels like restlessness, internal discomfort, jitteriness, pacing, fidgeting, feeling like your body just can't settle. Both of these states can be deeply uncomfortable, and both are signs of depression. So again, depression is not always sadness. So we want you to kind of open your mind up a little bit, and don't just label depression as what you think of innately quickly as what depression is. For many women in midlife, it can look different, and it can look more like emotional numbness or slowing down or that restless agitation. So I think it's also really important to distinguish between feeling depressed and having a depressive disorder. It's absolutely essential to understand the difference. So feeling depressed is a temporary emotional state. It's part of being human. It comes from stress, grief, overwhelm, exhaustion, and it often does respond to movement. Movement is a huge therapeutic intervention if we're feeling depressed. So many studies show this to be true. And you probably know it to be true innately, right? Like when you have a low mood, if you get up and move, you're going to feel better typically. And that's if it's just a feeling of depression. Light exposure, I talk about this nonstop, right? So getting out into the sun, or that kind of first day on vacation where you get out into the sun and it's been winter, that lifts that feeling of depression. Getting healthy fats, getting enough protein, dietary interventions can be huge in lifting that feeling of depression. Sleep, social connection, nervous system regulation, right? The point is that you can lift the feeling versus a depressive disorder, which is persistent. It's impairing your daily activities of life. It's affecting physiology, cognition, motivation, emotion, decision-making, sleep, appetite, and nervous system tone. It's really changing how you experience yourself and the world. And importantly, you can feel depressed without meeting the criteria for a disorder. You can also meet the criteria for a disorder without ever feeling sad, especially in perimenopause when hormones are fluctuating and our nervous system is impacted greatly by the environment and external stressors. Depressive disorders frequently present as irritability, overwhelm, shutting down, exhaustion, loss of joy, numbness, or withdrawal. So that's how you might be feeling. And let's step a little bit into the clinical lens. So to diagnose major depressive disorder, you need at least 2 weeks of either persistently low mood or loss of interest or pleasure, plus 5 of the following: lower irritable mood, anhedonia, which is loss of enjoyment, appetite or weight changes, sleep changes, so too much or too little, psychomotor slowing or psychomotor agitation, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, difficulty concentrating, suicidal thoughts, or preoccupation with death. So you need 5 or more of those. These symptoms must be present most of the day, nearly every day, and must impair functioning to meet this criteria. So this framework is very helpful, right? Because it does help to classify symptoms, but it doesn't actually capture the lived experience of depression, especially in hormonal transitions. And this is different from dysthymia. So this is a long-term functional but never well kind of grayness feeling. Many women live in this state for decades without realizing that it's actually treatable and that there might be many low-hanging fruit underlying causes that can be addressed. And this is different from seasonal affective disorder, for example. So this is more driven by lack of sunlight and circadian disruptions, serotonin shifts, and dopamine changes that will also accompany melatonin imbalances as the weather changes and we're not getting as much sunlight. It is so common in women who are indoors a lot or are in long winter climates. For example, in the Northeast of America, I do have quite a few patients who struggle with seasonal affective disorder. And this is different still from a depressive personality. So this was first described in the DSM-3, and a depressive personality is going to describe people who are sometimes deeper thinkers, introspective, emotionally sensitive, existential, contemplative. And this is not a pathology, but under stress or trauma, or certainly hormonal shifts during perimenopause, then this personality temperament can predispose someone to a depressive episode. This is definitely me. And it might be many of you who are listening. This is separate yet from an adjustment disorder with depressed mood. And this one is very common. So adjustment disorder with depressed mood is when symptoms of depression arise in response to a life stressor. So a breakup, a job loss, divorce, a major illness or diagnoses, major transitions, death of a loved one. This is not clinical depression in the major depressive disorder sense, but it is very real. It can be very painful, and it absolutely also deserves support. So I've got to touch on the chemical imbalance myth, and you can go back and listen to our episodes on SSRIs as well. We've got to touch on serotonin, right? For decades, we were told depression is caused by low serotonin. And this theory has been debunked. It is not that simple. A landmark review in 2005 and many since show no consistent evidence that depression is caused directly by a serotonin deficiency. Depression is influenced by neurotransmitters, yes, neurotransmitter receptor sensitivity, inflammation. Again, go back to our inflammatory depression episode if you haven't listened to that yet. Hormones, gut microbiome disruptions, vagal tone, mitochondrial health, stress physiology, sleep, trauma, meaning and purpose in life, identity, environment, and nervous system patterns. So this is why SSRIs can help some people. Yes, we talked about that in those episodes, but about 30% will experience little or no improvement on that particular class of drugs. So yes, medication can be a tool, but it's not a cure-all. I also want to touch on that sometimes the diagnosis of depression can get missed through midlife because we're coping, we're dealing with it, right? We're often self-medicating to deal with our depression or deal with our moods. And sometimes the symptoms can stay hidden even to ourselves. So we might numb our pain through alcohol, cannabis, sugar, shopping, gambling, overscheduling, working all the time, over exercising, scrolling on social media, excess use of stimulants, perfectionism, productivity. I'll definitely have an episode on high functioning depression. So just know that you might be masking your symptoms of depression through some of these behaviors. And remember, these are survival strategies. So I'll often ask patients, if you stopped numbing or if you stopped trying to fill the void with whatever habit is their habit of choice, how would you feel? So if you got quiet, if you slowed down, what is the state of your nervous system innately? And this is often where the truest truth emerges around their actual experience of depression or not. If you take nothing else from this episode, take this. Depression is multifactorial. It is never caused by one thing, not one hormone, not one neurotransmitter, not one trauma, not one event, not one chemical imbalance, right? Even when there is a clear trigger, like postpartum, in the perimenopausal phase, when there is a grief or a loss, when we've identified burnout or there's an actual physical illness, that trigger is going to interact with your biology, your nervous system, genetics, your level of resilience you've cultivated throughout your life, your coping systems, your gut health, hugely, your hormones, your inflammation levels, your trauma history, your meaning making, your community, your inner identity, and your personality style. So depression is complex, and it is an emergent phenomenon, or essentially a pattern arising from many systems interacting, which means that, guess what? There are multiple ways to heal, which our second part will be all about. So what are some of the root causes of depression? I'm going to touch on some biopsychosocial causes, and essentially you can divide root causes into three broad categories: root causes in the world around us, root causes in the body, and root causes in the mind. And depression usually arises from an interaction between all three. So let's talk about some of the root causes in the world. So some of the social and environmental causes. If you are living in poverty or you have a history of trauma or abuse, if you have a high ACEs or adverse childhood experiences score, these are all going to be environmental triggers. If you are a caregiver who's overloaded and overwhelmed, if you've experienced chronic stress and your cortisol is depleted or low, these are all environmental triggers of depression. Loneliness or disconnection from nature are going to be huge environmental triggers. Lack of sunlight, digital overload. So this world of social media is a huge environmental trigger for depression. Sedentary lifestyle, relentless productivity culture, so that burnout culture, Relationship strain, so having stress in our relationships or losing an important relationship in our life, unsafe environments, all of these are going to contribute to depressive physiology because as human beings, we require and long for connection. It's a biological imperative. We long to belong to something bigger than ourselves. We absolutely need sunlight exposure for that healthy serotonin production, even though depression is not directly caused by or cured by increasing or decreasing serotonin. Serotonin does play a role in our mood and in how we manufacture the rest of our neurotransmitters too. Movement, rhythms of our daily life and daily activity. We require safety in this daily rhythm. And if we don't feel safe, it is going to be a trigger for depression. So when these are missing, our mood is inevitably going to deteriorate. And if we don't take these environmental triggers into account, then very often, even if we do find that kind of magic pill or silver bullet treatment, which doesn't really exist, but even if we do start to feel a little better, if we don't address these environmental triggers, we will tend to relapse. Okay, so now let's talk about root causes in the body. As I mentioned, inflammation and cytokines. So I had a whole entire episode on this, but inflammation drives cytokine release, which activates microglia in the brain and definitely disrupts neurotransmitter production. This is a well-established mechanism in depression. So some triggers for this can include leaky gut, dysbiosis, chronic infections like Epstein-Barr virus, food sensitivities, and environmental toxins. All of those will increase inflammatory depression. Iron deficiency and anemia. This is one of the most common and overlooked drivers of low mood, especially in women in perimenopause. If you've had a couple kids or you've had heavy periods, you've had blood loss, chances are you might have low ferritin. And low ferritin is a huge contributor to low mood. It is a main physical body root cause that I see because iron is essential for oxygen delivery, for mitochondrial ATP production, so your energy levels, and for neurotransmitter synthesis. You need iron to make serotonin. A ferritin of a level around 10 or so often feels like depression. A ferritin of 60 can feel like you are alive again. So get your iron, including your ferritin, checked. Hormonal shifts can be a huge body root cause in perimenopause and menopause. We've talked before about estrogen shapes our serotonin and dopamine levels. Progesterone regulates GABA, our inhibitory calming neurotransmitter, and cortisol, your major stress hormone, impacts everything. I've talked endlessly on social media about how cortisol and our HPA axis are going to be predictors for major depressive disorder throughout perimenopause and menopause. Your thyroid drives your energy, cognition, and mood. So as your thyroid hormone might be under functioning, that's going to be a huge trigger for depression. Very often subclinical hypothyroidism, so having low T4 and low T3 can manifest like depression. It can go missed. Your TSH might look fine. I have a whole episode on thyroid health. Go back and listen to that one. And definitely pregnenolone levels are something that I look into as far as physical root causes of depression in perimenopause and menopause. Testosterone levels also are going to greatly impact motivation and drive, and very often low testosterone can look like depression in perimenopause and menopause. So when our hormones shift, our mood can dramatically shift. And an SSRI or a drug that impacts our norepinephrine or another neurotransmitter is not necessarily going to address the root cause of the hormone imbalance that's driving the low mood. And then our nervous system state. So I will have a whole episode on depression through the lens of our nervous system state. But so many women I wouldn't even label them as depressed. They're in dorsal vagal shutdown when they first come see me. So they're in that dorsal vagal collapse, numbness, fatigue, withdrawal, loss of spark state. So go back and listen to our episode on the Safe and Sound protocol. And again, I'll have another episode on depression through the lens of polyvagal theory. But essentially, this is a biological pattern. It is not a psychological failure. And very often, if we can frame our understanding of our depression through a nervous system lens, not only can we take away some of the shame or guilt we might have around it, but we immediately have more tools accessible to alleviate that symptom. The gut-brain axis is a huge root cause that has a body-based biology. So SIBO, candida, dysbiosis, low butyrate, low short-chain fatty acids, poor protein intake, nutrient malabsorption, all of this is going to shape our mood. If we have inflammation in our gut and we can't digest and absorb our food, we're not breaking down our protein and using it to make our neurotransmitters, then it is the breeding ground for low mood. Similarly, if we don't have enough, for example, omega-3s in our diet, so much research has been done on low omega fatty acid status or essential fatty acid status and depression and low mood. So if we're not getting enough of those in our diet, if we don't have active B vitamins in our diet, especially if we have an MTHFR genetic SNP, if we don't have enough zinc or magnesium or vitamin D, all of these affect our mood. So nutrient status is huge when I'm assessing a body-based or biological root cause for depression. Chronic pain is a body cause for depression. So chronic pain drives depression. If we're in chronic pain, we're going to experience more depression. Our mitochondrial health drives our mood and depression. So low ATP is going to look like low emotional resilience. Your mood really does depend on your energy. If you have no energy and you can't do the things you want to do, of course you're going to have a lower mood. You're also going to get less natural dopamine hits throughout the day because you're not accomplishing as much. You're not really crossing those things off your list, essentially. Now let's talk about some of the root causes in the mind. So rumination and overthinking. Overthinking keeps depression alive. Rumination and kind of this overstimulation of the default mode network can really drive depression. And mindfulness interrupts these loops. We're going to talk all about that in part 2. Also, trauma and adverse childhood experiences. So trauma is going to shape our cortisol curve and our HPA axis response to stress. It's going to impact our neuroception and interoception. So essentially our scanning both the environment and internally for safety. It's going to impact our brain wiring. Trauma is going to have an impact on how our brain wires and fires. Also, through neuroplasticity and mindfulness, we can rewire our brain, which is so empowering and gives me a lot of hope. Trauma is going to shape our inflammatory levels in our body as well. So we've talked before about the inflammatory reflex and how vagal tone impacts inflammation. And definitely just vagal tone in general is going to predispose us to lower mood or depression. And depression can be a reflection of our internal psyche, or essentially the terrain of our psyche. It can signal an internal part that's exhausted, overwhelmed, grieving, or trying to protect you. So this is very common in midlife, right? And through midlife transitions, when we're asking questions like, who am I now? What is my identity? What's ending? What's beginning? What about my life no longer fits anymore? Depression can really arise as we're moving through this threshold of change. So let's give a couple patient examples. So let's first talk about iron deficiency. I had a woman a few weeks ago and she presented with menopausal depression. When I initially ran her blood work, because remember, I'm looking for some what I call low-hanging fruit. So essentially, I'm looking for a physical, biochemical, body-based root cause initially working with a patient, because sometimes it's quick and easy to fix, right? Like we want to feel better. So this woman had a ferritin of 8. She was feeling very hopeless, brain fog, this heavy, deep fatigue. And through addressing her iron stores and gut healing, which was the root cause of her low ferritin, her depression lifted. This was a pretty classic, clear-cut biochemical root cause of depression. And I love when it's that easy. It's not always, but sometimes it is. And how cool is that? Next, a quick example of a high-performing woman who crashed after years of stress. So she had never struggled with depression before. Her depression was also clearly physiological. She had flatlined cortisol. There was absolutely no cortisol curve existent when we looked at her cortisol. And so our intervention immediately was actually around nervines and taking time to relax and calm her nervous system so that we could work on her adrenals and we could work on healthy cortisol production throughout the day. And then quickly a multifactorial depression where the patient had MTHFR mutation. So methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase is a gene that codes for an enzyme of the same name. If we have difficulty methylating, it can compromise not only our detox pathways or give us a higher risk of cardiovascular events, but it's also really important in our manufacturing of our neurotransmitters. So this patient had not only that MTHFR SNP, but a severe trauma history, also had gut dysbiosis and systemic inflammation. So we started to work on all of those root causes as we saw her depression lift. So that was not just a single root cause, right? It was multi-layered care. And as you know, if you've been a listener for a while, we start with the gut-brain axis because that is going to have the most profound ripple effect on all of those root causes. So you might be sitting there thinking, okay, well, I have some mind, I have some body, and I have some world root causes. But what about genetics and family risk? So a family history of depression in a first degree relative does increase your risk, but it does not determine your fate, right? Genes load the gun and environment truly pulls the trigger. So I like to think about our lifestyle, our diet, our lifestyle, our daily habits as directing that bullet. And ideally, we're directing it away. So, nervous system regulation, mindfulness, breath work, which we're going to talk about in part 2, can really diffuse this entire circuit. And genes are just a tendency toward depression. They are not our destiny. So, just because your mom or dad struggled with depression or your grandma or your grandpa does not mean that you have to. You might, but you don't have to. Okay, so we talked a lot about what depression is, what it isn't, and I want to kind of bring this home for us before we move on to part 2. So, depression is not one thing, right? It's not caused by one chemical. There's not one cause. It's not even really one diagnosis, unless we're talking about major depressive disorder. And I will have a separate episode on bipolar. It's not one pathway and it's not one story. Depression is a physiology. It can be a nervous system pattern. It can be a hormone shift. It can be a gut disruption. That is huge. This is why I focus on the gut-brain axis with all of my mental health patients. It can be an inflammatory state. It can be a psychological landscape or inner psyche terrain. It can be a personality pattern. It can be a response to a social context. It can be a trauma imprint. It can be an existential crisis. It can be a protective nervous system response. It can be our body trying to keep us safe. It can be a sign that we've lost resilience. And it absolutely can be a call for reconnection and healing. And because depression is multifactorial, because low mood is multifactorial, major depressive disorder is multifactorial, dysthymia is multifactorial. There are multiple routes to healing. There are so many ways to feel better if you are someone who feels depressed. I am a perfect example. Most people who meet me would have no idea that I've struggled with depression. And this is something that I have had to work on for my whole life. I strike most people as pretty happy, and I do prioritize my mental health. I do focus on happiness, or really contentment, I would say, not even happiness, but that's a whole other episode. And there are multiple ways I do this with great success. And that is what I want to share with you in the next part of this episode. So in part 2, we will explore mindfulness and self-compassion tools, somatic and nervous system-based tools, psychotherapy, nutritional psychiatry, hormone support, gut healing, inflammation reduction, botanical medicine, one of my favorites, homeopathy, psychobiotics, sunlight, movement, social connection, spiritual repair, meaning making, and how to build a buffered, resilient life. If depression has touched your life or someone you love, part 2 is going to offer you a map forward, because you are not broken. You are definitely not alone, and your story is not over. I promise you, you are far more powerful than you think. And once you have some of these tools, your life is not going to look the same again. If you're someone who struggled with depression, please stay tuned for part 2.